TikTok is banned. The Supreme Court refuses to stay the execution of the law that, effective January 19th, forces TikTok to be sold to a U.S. company or to shut down. You might have seen customers react to the U.S. government trying to ban TikTok over concerns that its Chinese parent company could exert too much control and provide information to the Chinese government by downloading a TikTok clone that is literally run by the Chinese government. How did we get here? No! As you probably know, TikTok is a foreign-owned tech platform operating on American devices. Chinese technology company ByteDance launched the app in 2016. It now has over 1.5 billion active users, including about 150 million Americans. Now, many Americans make their living by making short films on the app, and TikTok's creators say that other social media platforms lack TikTok's organic reach and collaboration tools. Some have said, quote, they have posted the same content on other platforms for years, but only TikTok has fostered their communities and allowed them to reach broad audiences. Now, the people who serve in Congress generally don't grow up with social media platforms. The average age of a senator is 64, and the average age of a House member is 58. And that might be one reason members of Congress struggle with the implications of modern technology, which obviously is global. But for better or worse, the government is responsible for protecting the country from foreign threats. But it also has a duty to ensure Americans have civil liberties. Now, the courts traditionally defer to the federal government in matters of national security. And along those lines, on April 24, 2024, Congress enacted the Protecting Americans from Foreign Adversary-Controlled Applications Act. The law prohibits the distribution, maintenance, or provision of internet hosting services for applications controlled by foreign adversaries. The act identifies China, North Korea, Russia, and Iran as foreign adversaries of the United States who are not eligible to purchase apps. The law officially bars Americans from using apps controlled by those countries. And the law requires ByteDance specifically to sell TikTok to remove, quote, foreign adversary control, and failure to comply results in a ban within 270 to 360 days. Now, the Supreme Court generally considers laws targeting specific speech as presumptively unconstitutional. In 2020, Donald Trump issued 2 executive orders banning TikTok, but the federal courts blocked both of those. So many legal commentators felt the new law was also on shaky ground. So when this new law was passed, TikTok and a group of its users sued the government, once again arguing that the act is an unconstitutional intrusion on free speech rights. Quote, by banning all online platforms and software applications offered by TikTok and all ByteDance subsidiaries, Congress has made a law curtailing massive amounts of protected speech. Unlike broadcast television and radio stations, which require government licenses to operate because they use the public airwaves, the government cannot, consistent with the First Amendment, dictate the ownership of newspapers, websites, online platforms, and other privately created speech forums. Now, TikTok claimed that it's an American company headquartered in Culver City, California, which means it has First Amendment rights. Thus, TikTok alleged that courts should apply a legal standard called strict scrutiny. Now, when it comes to reviewing government regulation, what level of scrutiny the court applies is usually the entire ballgame. When a court applies strict scrutiny, the government must show that the law is the least restrictive means of advancing a compelling governmental interest. And that is a very, very hard standard to meet. Strict scrutiny applies when the law regulates fundamental rights like freedom of speech. Now, normally when courts are reviewing governmental regulation, if it doesn't involve a fundamental right, the courts apply what's called rational basis review, which basically means that the court can find any rational basis for a particular law. It will uphold that law. Basically, any law that's reviewed under rational basis review is going to be upheld. And basically any law that's reviewed under strict scrutiny is not going to pass muster and then will be found to be not constitutional. And then there's a third option that's sort of a combination of the two. It's sort of right down the middle, It's called intermediate scrutiny. That's used when laws involve a right, but one that's not fundamental. Now, the U.S. government argued that the act doesn't implicate the First Amendment at all. The government rejected plaintiffs' assertion that TikTok is a U.S. company entitled to free speech rights because it's a subsidiary of ByteDance. And ByteDance, as a foreign company, does not receive free speech rights. But what about TikTok's American users? Well, the government claimed that the act doesn't regulate their speech at all. Americans remain free to say whatever they want on other platforms. And in fact, they would continue to be free to say whatever they wanted in a post-investiture version of TikTok. The government argued that the court should use the rational basis test, which is the lowest level of review, and not surprisingly, the government argued for rational basis review. And as we talked about, the standard there is that the government's actions have to be rationally related to a legitimate government interest. That is an extremely, extremely low bar. The government can usually come up with a rational reason, meaning basically any reason whatsoever, that is related to a legitimate government interest, meaning basically any governmental interest at all. All the government has to do is show that there's a hypothetical connection between the interest and the statute's goals. So this litigation went up on appeal. In TikTok versus Garland, the U.S. Court of Appeals for the District of Columbia upheld the constitutionality of the Protecting Americans from Foreign Adversary-Controlled Applications Act. Now, the first question for the court was what standard of review to apply. And the court said, quote, "We conclude that the act implicates the First Amendment and is subject to heightened scrutiny. Whether strict scrutiny or intermediate scrutiny applies is a closer question. The relevant portions of the act are facially content neutral, but the government arguably based its content and regulation justification for the act upon the content on the platform. We think it only prudent, therefore, to assume without deciding that the higher standard applied." Now, side note, what does the court mean when it says it assumes without deciding that a certain standard applies? Well, the court is declining to rule as a matter of law that a particular standard applies, usually because the outcome of a case would be the same regardless of which standard the court used. And in something that basically never happens, the Court of Appeals ruled that the government could clear the high bar set by strict scrutiny. Part 1 of the test is whether the government has a compelling interest. And the Court of Appeals said, quote, "The government offered 2 national security justifications. 1, to counter the PRC's efforts to collect great quantities of data about tens of millions of Americans. And 2, to limit the PRC's ability to manipulate content covertly on the TikTok platform. The former does not reference the content of speech or reflect disagreement with an idea or message." The court agreed with the government that China posed a, quote, "hybrid commercial threat because it had adopted laws that enable it to access and use data held by Chinese companies." Now, does the U.S. have any evidence that China has leveraged these relationships to access American data? Well, it's classified, apparently. Now, all this was appealed to the Supreme Court, and in the government's brief there, Attorney General Merrick Garland said Congress has received classified security briefings about TikTok. Theoretically, a court could have ordered the government to produce evidence from these briefings in an in-camera review, meaning a secret review, which would ensure the information was kept secret. But so far, no court has asked the government to provide evidence of those briefings. So the national security threats are hypothetical. The government predicts that if the Chinese government asked TikTok to, quote, "manipulate content for censorship, propaganda, or other malign purposes," TikTok would try to comply with that order. But TikTok asserted that the government's concerns about data collection were made in bad faith. America is the only member of the G7 without a federal data privacy legislation or unified approach to data governance. TikTok and many other apps collect large swaths of data about its users, including device information, IP address, keystroke patterns, activity across devices, browsing and search history, etc., and location data. Now, this is my opinion, but if data collection is a national security threat, then Maybe Congress should pass a data privacy law stopping Twitter and Facebook from collecting the same data as TikTok. Just a thought. But the Court of Appeals saw things differently, quote, that the act does not fully solve the data collection threat posed by the PRC does not mean it was not a step in the right direction. And the court quoted liberally from the government's brief, stating, quote, as Assistant Director of National Intelligence, Casey Blackburn explained, the PRC is the most active and persistent cyber espionage threat to the U.S. government, private sector, and critical infrastructure networks. Its hacking program spans the globe and is larger than that of every other major nation combined. The PRC has prepositioned itself for potential cyber attacks against U.S. critical infrastructure by building out offensive weapons within that infrastructure. Consistent with that assessment, the government has found persistent PRC access in U.S. critical telecommunications, energy, water, and other infrastructure. And the court noted that a bipartisan group of legislators concluded that China tracks user data, quote, of particular relevance to the government's first justification for the act. The PRC has engaged in extensive and years-long efforts to accumulate structured datasets, in particular on U.S. persons, to support its intelligence and counterintelligence operations. So the court found that the government's two national security justifications were compelling state interests. And it's not surprising that the court deferred to the federal government's judgment about the severity of the national security threats. However, that's only the first part of the strict scrutiny test analysis. In part 2 of the test, the government has to show that the law is narrowly tailored to that interest, or that it's the least speech-restrictive means available to the government. But TikTok proposed a number of less speech-restrictive options that they argued could have satisfied the government's goals without burdening speech. Quote, these include disclosure or reporting requirements, the government using speech of its own to counter any alleged foreign propaganda, limiting TikTok's collection of location and contact data, and extending the ban of TikTok on government devices to government employees' personal devices. But the court rejected these options, instead agreeing with the government that data collection and content manipulation are not the type of harm that can be remediated by disclosure. Traditionally, the remedy for speech we disagree with is more speech. That's a foundational aspect of the First Amendment. But here the court rejects this principle entirely, quote, the idea that the government can simply use speech of its own to counter the risk of content manipulation by the PRC is likewise naive. The court said, quote, the petitioner's attempt to frame the use of government speech as a means of countering alleged foreign propaganda is beside the point. It is the secret manipulation of the content on TikTok, not foreign propaganda, that poses a grave threat to national security. No amount of government speech can mitigate that threat nearly as effectively as divestiture. The court also dismissed the TikTok creator's argument that the government could achieve its goals by banning TikTok from collecting the data. Quote, the data collection risks identified by the government include the PRC's ability to use TikTok for bulk collection of data and for targeted collection on individuals. Thank you for watching. Leave your comment and we want to know your opinion. Can TikTok still be banned?